Each year, Thomson Reuters Regulatory Intelligence publishes its thoughts on the most pressing risks for firms in the new year. This year, the list includes cyber resilience, incentives and remuneration, vulnerable customers, implementation and embedding of regulatory change, and technology risk. The author is Susannah Hammond, Senior Regulatory Intelligence Expert at Thomson Reuters Regulatory Intelligence, and she's with me to go into a little more detail on the 5 risks. So, Susannah, cyber resilience, outside the skill and comfort zone of many senior managers.
Yeah.
So what's expected in practice?
Well, a lot of the studies have come out and said that if you do the basics well, that will actually solve an awful lot of your problems. In fact, Financial Stability Board had a workshop last year where the great and the good got around the table, and they came out really with a statement saying 90% or so of all of the cyber resilience risks and issues, so you know, the attacks, the ransomware, that sort of thing, basically could be stopped if you did what they called the basic housekeeping, the basic hygiene around cyber resilience. So the sense is that for the senior managers who this is so far outside their comfort zone, the 2 things they really should be doing, one is making sure it's on their risk map, their risk radar, but then asking the sort of somewhat obvious questions as to what are we doing? Explain to me what we're doing. You know, what is it we're doing? Do we know what information needs protecting? How are we protecting it? How do we know that protection works? And those very basic sorts of questions, in theory, should go a very long way to meeting cyber resilience requirements.
Okay. In terms of governance at top level, is there a need, you think, to make somebody responsible for this on the board?
I think it's a collective responsibility because it's the governance of the firm that is inherent there. But what I would suggest at the highest levels, probably looking at the skill sets there. So to bring it, shall we say, closer to a comfort zone is probably a very good idea. It's a little old now, but Andrew Tyree, who, the chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, made it very clear that skill sets at the highest levels of firms needed to include IT and cyber. And I think that holds true no matter where in the world you are. If we're in a technological age, boards of firms need to have those skills.
Okay, so you need a techie director on the board?
Techie director would definitely help, but techie skills throughout the piece would not be a bad idea.
Okay, so moving on to incentives, Financial Stability Board remains focused on incentives. And has now refined its approach to look at the continuing misconduct risk. So can you tell us a little bit more about this new approach from the FSB?
2 things, I suppose, are the sort of overarching pieces. One is the FSB has made the express link between incentives and misconduct. Now, when they first brought out their principles for incentives and remuneration, almost the very first thing they did after the financial crisis, it was have something that doesn't encourage inappropriate risk-taking. Fair enough. They've now got to the stage where actually they've made the link totally between misconduct and incentives, and firms are on notice that that link has been made and need to make sure that their incentive and remuneration programs don't encourage misconduct in any shape or form. The other element of this is that the FSB has made totally and utterly crystal clear that the responsibility for misconduct lies with the board. Now, you combine those 2 things together, you need a board level policy and approach to incentives and remuneration. And you need to make sure that the board truly understands the ramifications of that there must be line of sight to what's going on, it must be clear and transparent. You're probably going to need a whole range of non-financial metrics in there, as well as financial metrics. And then last but not least, you can expect your regulator to ask questions about it now.
Yeah.
And it's not a completely final policy approach from the FSB, but it is out there and it is not going to change very much from the consultation.
The thing that surprises me, I don't know whether you feel the same, but after mis-selling scandals by commission-driven salesmen, after LIBOR, I'm surprised that it's taken the FSB quite so long to get to this point of drawing a link.
I think the FSB was almost expecting, I think the FSB always had that link, let me put it that way. But I think the FSB has perhaps slightly lost patience with it being fixed. And now they have simply said, this is the last straw. Misconduct and incentives, we are linking it to the board being responsible. You will make it happen this way. I think they gave firms and indeed regulators around the world enough latitude to sort it out for themselves. No longer. They've made it their policy objective.
That's really interesting. I mean, the FCA in the UK has been all over conduct risk, which is essentially their way of dealing with this problem.
Yep.
And the US has also been looking very clearly at the responsibility of individuals for activities within firms when dealing with firms. Is it other jurisdictions that aren't up to keeping up?
Well, the argument is that even with those approaches, misconduct has not been stamped out. So this is the latest step towards eradicating misconduct. I mean, I'm not sure we will ever get to that nirvana, but it is the latest step to keep the pressure on to eradicate as much misconduct as possible.
So even with the senior manager regime in the UK, there's still yet more to do. That's really important, isn't it? That we keep up to date with how far this might go.
Yeah. And it makes that link very, very clear.
Yeah. Okay. So another one of the 5 risks, vulnerable customers. So why is vulnerable customers still so much of an issue?
It's a double whammy almost. I mean, we're having new products all the time, shiny new ideas coming out for people to go play with. Binary options, Bitcoin, virtual currencies, take your pick as to what the flavour of the day is. Very, very few of those are suitable for retail customers. And retail customers who indulge, shall we say, in these things are potentially going to be very vulnerable to some very big losses.
Okay.
And so there is the whole suite of new products that are simply not appropriate for retail customers. The other element that is coming into play are ageing populations, particularly in the Western world. We've got the UK regulator, the US regulator. They're not necessarily saying that older people are by definition vulnerable, but they are less likely to be able to recover from being vulnerable to being missold, to being misrepresented what a product can and can't do for them. And so there is a collective and growing concern that firms need to understand the needs of vulnerable customers, particularly seniors, as they're called in the States, in the sense of product design, approach, making sure they are not excluded from things that could be good for them in the right sense of that word. And it's just the sense that vulnerable customers are an underlying thread on an awful lot of regulatory innovation and change and rulebook change. And firms need to know what their approach is, why it's that approach, and be able to explain that to a regulator as to why it's a good thing.
Okay. So if, as you say, being older, being senior is potentially going to lead to vulnerability, but not necessarily. This implies that firms are going to need to take a much more individualistic view of their client base to tell who is and who isn't vulnerable.
Potentially.
That's going to push up the costs of dealing with those customers. Is that not potentially going to lead to a potential raising of the bar in terms of how economic it is to deal with certain types of customer?
It's entirely possible. I mean, we're back to the concept of target markets. Do you have a target market of, shall we say, more vulnerable people?
Yeah.
If you can design a product that is suitable for those that are potentially vulnerable, and you can do it on a blanket basis, perhaps those costs do not arise because it is, part of your suitability criteria up front, you are in that target market. But the flip side to that is also the creation of negative target markets. This product is not suitable for that tranche of people. Do not sell it to them.
Yeah.
So I'd like to think that whilst there may be some costs involved, the marketplace itself is potentially so large that you could spread those over a lot of people.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how the economics of a greater attention on vulnerable customers actually plays
Absolutely.
out. So moving on to regulatory change. So many firms are in the process of, or have been in the process of dealing with huge regulatory change projects. So MiFID II, just one example. Embedding is now the way to go. Obviously, the regime is now in force. So what are the possible concerns that you have in terms of embedding MiFID II?
You really just have to look back to MiFID I and what happened in the wake of that. And perhaps the best example of all is transaction reporting, which should not have been the most difficult aspect of MiFID I, or indeed MiFID II, but it just seemed to be something that firms were really bad at getting consistently right. And perhaps the best example is Merrill Lynch, fined £34.5 million here in the UK last October for getting transaction reporting wrong repeatedly. And that's still under the MiFID I regime. It's not as though the UK regulator hasn't warned and repeated and said you have to get it right. We're also into a different environment with regard to transaction reporting because of the use of the information by the regulators. They need that information to be good because of the market abuse directives and the regulations, and they share this across borders. They can't do that element of their job. They can't fulfil their own objectives if they're getting rubbish information from firms. And that's another incentive for the regulators to go after firms to make sure that their transaction reporting is happening appropriately. Now, it's not the shiniest, most glamorous part of any directive or regulation, but it's a basic that has to be got right. And you must reconcile and you must check it's working properly. We're now into a world in the UK where if you get it wrong again, the fines are likely to be truly stratospheric. And now, with senior managers regime, you fall foul of this in that world, personal liability is likely to be there as well.
Absolutely. You mentioned reconciliation in your list there. I mean, that's key, isn't it? I mean,
totally key. Both. Don't assume what you have sent to the regulator is what they've received, and you have populated all of those fields properly, because experience shows that that has simply not been the case, that people have shoved things down in the wrong currency, the wrong time, populated the wrong fields, and just assumed it was all fine.
So reconciliation with the regulator, also build in reconciliation as far as you can within your own processes before it gets shoved out to the regulator.
And none of this is rocket science. No. That's the sort of real irritant for the regulator, that this really isn't rocket science. Just go invest and get it right.
It's an aspect of technology, in fact. So moving on to the last of the 5 key risks, technology. So what are the key concerns there?
It's again a double whammy one, because large numbers of firms, particularly the big firms, have got legacy IT systems which are in potentially desperate need of updating, but you have got your entire IT change capacity absorbed by MiFID II, MiFIR, General Data Protection Regulation, whatever it happens to be. And then what you also need is a very stable, consistent IT infrastructure, platform and support, so you can get the best out of RegTech, FinTech, all of the new fun toys that are out there. So firms are in the sort of dilemma of, you've got to upgrade your underlying IT systems, but you've got to comply with all of this regulatory change. And unless you do all of that, you're not going to be able to take best advantage of the new toys that are out there in the marketplace. It's a tough one. It really is. And balancing the commercial and compliance demands there is going to be a balancing act totally for the board. Perhaps back to the skill sets we were talking about, you have to understand what IT can and can't do for you to get those judgment calls right. But technology risk in the fundamental sense, we're not talking about security or cyber or anything, it's just what is the technology doing for you? Can it evidence your compliance on a consistent basis? Have you embedded all your regulatory change? And is it sufficiently stable and operating sufficiently effectively that you can go and play with FinTech?
But if you are one of those firms that's still operating with computer systems they've inherited that don't talk to each other because they've merged 2 companies at some point in the past, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? You've simply got to put your hand in your pocket and pay for this upgrade.
I really do think so. But there are so many other demands on your budget and your time and your resources. I would suggest that has to be fixed as a higher priority than really quite a lot of other things now.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Susannah, for that look through the 5 key risks. This is Ashley Kovas, Senior Regulatory Intelligence Expert for Thomson Reuters. And don't forget to have a look at our website, risk.thomsonreuters.com.